In today's lecture, we will be discussing production function. Since we discussed form in the last lecture, and forms produce goods and services. Goods can be burgers, can be cars, can be aircrafts, can be, and services can be internet services, phone services, teaching services, anything can be services. So all these forms produce goods and services. In a production function, we try to put the inputs and outputs together. Let's try to understand it. So what is a production function? It shows how much output can the firm produce given different amounts of inputs. Now what is the output and what is the input? In this case, Q is the output, which can be your burgers, aeroplanes, or services like internet, movie, whatever. And all of them are put together in a black box, which we denote by a function. Function is a mathematical notation which basically says you put things in, and what are the stuffs I'm putting in here? NR, L, K, T, E, and I will explain each of them one by one in a bit. But basically the idea here is that function is a black box, or production function is a black box. You put inputs and something comes out as output, and those outputs, as I said, can be anything that's bought and sold in the market. So let's go one by one. NR implies natural resources, which we all know we need raw materials and also land to produce goods and services. L is labor. Obviously, without labor, you cannot produce anything. K is capital. Generally in economics, we denote capital by K instead of C. T is technology. Now think about, can you produce anything without technology? And technology can be anything as simple as a hammer, which is a tool, or very complex technology like NASA's space missions. And finally, entrepreneurship. Now, entrepreneurship is a concept perhaps you have heard a lot. So the job of an entrepreneur is to bring all these other resources together to produce something. And when the person brings all these other resources together, that service itself is called entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is a service which goes into this black box, which is called production function. So this is the black box, production function, and what comes out from there is the Q, which is the output that firms are producing. Next, I would like to differentiate between fixed and variable inputs. Now, what is a fixed input? These inputs, those that can't be easily increased or decreased in a short period of time. Suppose you are running a restaurant, right? And a restaurant, suppose you have capacity to seat 30 people at a time. One day suddenly there was a big party came up, and there was a party of 50 people. Obviously you don't have the space. Can you expand the space? Maybe from 30 you can go up to 40, right? But from 30 to 50 you can't do it. So in that case, your land or the space where you have a restaurant is the fixed input. On the other hand, there are variable inputs which can be increased or decreased based on your need. For example, so again the restaurant example, suppose you have space for 50 people. Generally on a day 30 people only show up. But if in a particular day 50 people shows up and there's an increased demand for the service, so what you can do, you can just go and hire maybe somebody on a short-term basis on that day. And that's why often labor is a variable input. Along with labor, raw material is also a variable input. So typically labor is a variable input, whereas land is a fixed input. And economists often use a very shorthand for production function, which is Q, which is the output, is a function f of L and K, where L represents all the variable inputs, typically the labor, and K represents all the fixed inputs, which is basically the land or capital. Capital is a fixed input, machineries. For example, again in a restaurant example, you cannot have multiple stoves in your kitchen, right? You might have like 10 different stoves. You can't just make it at 20 stoves overnight. So generally machineries or capital is a fixed input. Another distinction I would like to make is short run versus long run. This is a very important distinction in economics, both in microeconomics and macroeconomics. Let's try to understand what is a short run. In microeconomics, short run is a period during which at least some factors of production are fixed. So in a short run, some of the factors of production, which can be land, which can be labor, which can be capital, which can be entrepreneurship, are fixed. Whereas in the long run, all factors are variable. This is very important. Think about in a long run. If you're running a restaurant and your restaurant typically has accommodation for 30 people, but you typically are getting 50 on a regular basis, then perhaps it's time for your restaurant to expand. So in the long run, you can expand the space, but in the short run, obviously you can't do.